So I'm guessing that if you asked most clergy what is the most challenging of the Sundays we are called to preach, we probably wouldn't immediately say the Sunday of 4th of July weekend. We might start with Easter or Christmas, although personally I think those are among the very best times to preach. And yet, after some reflection, I think many of us in the clergy ranks would conclude that preaching on the Sunday of 4th of July holiday week is actually quite challenging. As leaders tasked with providing spiritual guidance to all people, Jesus and the 4th of July pose difficult theological questions around the messy relationship between God and country and the dilemma of times when these two entities are competing loyalties. The challenge happens when our nationalistic tendencies are actually in conflict with God, who truly is larger than any one particular country. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the 4th of July, the fireworks, the hot dogs, the picnics, the time off to remember our founding fathers and their incredible wisdom, foresight, and prophetic witness in writing the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. It used to be the tradition of 4th of July was a time when families and communities in our nation gathered together to read the entire document of the Declaration of Independence, word for word. That used to be the tradition. Sadly, that tradition seems to be lost, and many of us struggle even to quote from that incredible text. I would encourage you sometime this week to Google the Declaration of Independence and read the stirring words again for yourself. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that it says all men, I'll change it just slightly, that all people are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The less quoted end of the Declaration of Independence has these words: "And for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." It's actually quite sobering to think that the founding fathers, in signing this document, pledged to one another their entire lives, all their money, including inheritances, and their reputations. That is sacrificial giving. So this is what we celebrate on the 4th of July, this idea of freedom and equality that our nation was founded on. And on our best days, I like to think this is what we are all about. And yet, when convictions of our faith conflict with national demands, we are called to trust and follow Jesus regardless of the consequences. As Christians, our ultimate allegiance is with God. And yet we love and appreciate our country too. Now, I've mentioned this before. While I was growing up, my family hosted 7 exchange students, each of whom lived with us for a year at a time. They hailed from Mexico, Germany, Ecuador, and Egypt, and all of my siblings, all 4 of us, were also exchange students living in other parts of the world. I lived in Colombia in South America. My sister lived in Germany. She lived in Denmark. She lived in Germany later. And both of my brothers lived in Mexico, each of us for a year. One of the things that I learned, both having exchange students live in our family and also living with other families, is an appreciation for the ways in which other people do things and understanding of the rich heritage of what it means for my own country. You know, I found new appreciation when I lived abroad for the love of my own country and our traditions. Distance truly does make the heart grow fonder. So as we gather this 4th of July week, I invite you to consider with me about our Christian concept of freedom and what it means as Christians to practice what I like to call prophetic patriotism. Now, in these days and times that we currently live in, with the scary rise of Christian nationalism, it's important for us to get really clear about what our theology of freedom is really all about. And considering the decisions that just came down from our Supreme Court this week, just on Friday and Thursday, and the communities that have been harmed by those decisions, we need to be crystal clear as Christians. What is our theology of freedom? The Christian understanding of freedom does not mean something like we are free to do whatever we want. It's also not about superiority or forcing our beliefs on someone else. Just going to say that again. It's not about superiority or forcing our beliefs on someone else. Rather, it's a gift that we're given by our Creator. Freedom is not something we earn. Freedom, in the Christian understanding, is a call to serve others. Listen again to those words that Anne read to us from Paul's letter to the Galatians. You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only don't let this freedom be an opportunity to indulge your selfish impulses, but serve one another through love. All the law has been fulfilled in a single statement: love your neighbor as yourself. Pledging your life, your fortune, your sacred honor to others comes close to what Paul had in mind when he wrote about this call to freedom. Freedom in the Christian understanding is a call to love and serve our neighbors and others. For an example of freedom lived out, we look to Jesus, who freely chose as his mission walking with the poor, lifting up the downtrodden, being a light to all the nations, loving one's enemies, touching the untouchables, exhibiting lavish amounts of mercy and justice and love for everyone, no exceptions. That is the biblical understanding of freedom. And if we wish to practice our patriotism, then our call as Christians is to this kind of freedom and service. A freedom and service without boundaries and borders. And in today's world, it is actually prophetic to speak these truths against a backdrop of those who are sowing seeds of hate and fear and violence and injustice and intolerance. This past week marks the 6th anniversary of the passing of two people who have had a very profound influence on my life. I consider both of them to be prophetic patriots, both who practice Christian freedom and love of neighbor and self-giving sacrifice all of their days. Jim White was a layperson with whom I worked closely in the 7 years that I served at the Livonia Newburgh United Methodist Church as associate pastor. At Newburgh, I was responsible for guiding the youth leaders as they worked with the youth, and Jim was a volunteer youth leader extraordinaire, working then mostly with junior high youth, which tells you everything you need to know. He chose that. He loved it. When he died, he had been an active youth leader for 30 years. In that time, he profoundly influenced the lives of hundreds and hundreds of youth, several of whom are lay and clergy leaders throughout the Michigan Annual Conference today. Others have gone on to successful secular jobs, but they credit Jim with being one of the most influential human beings in their lives. As I watched Jim in action and learned from him, I was amazed at how he made people feel welcomed and loved and accepted. Those junior high years, especially, are times when we often feel awkward in our own bodies, and Jim would have the youth repeat the phrase, "I am lovable and capable." I am lovable and capable. This message stuck with so many of them. He built up their self-esteem. He made them laugh with silly jokes and his infectious smile. He reminded them with his presence of the love of Christ that would never let them go. One of Jim's passions was the Appalachia Service Project, ASP. I'm thinking some of you might have heard of that. And he served as a group leader on ASP for most of his 30 years of ministry. Many of the youth, now adults, talk about the influence of this mission work on their lives. Later this summer, you're going to be hearing from a person who's going off to seminary, and she was influenced by ASP and Jim. Jim reflects the best parts of the church. Jim reminds us of the call to serve others, even if it means making trays and trays of garlic bread, as you see in the picture. Another who, for me, embodies Christian freedom and prophetic patriotism was the Reverend Edward Curtis Coley. I couldn't find a good picture of him, so this is one from my scrapbook, so it's a little bit blurry. This was from back when our daughter Grace was baptized. Reverend Ed Coley, when I first knew him, he was already a retired pastor. But in 1943, when he just turned 18, he dropped out of his senior year of high school in Ozark, Arkansas, and he joined the Army Air Corps, and then he enlisted in the Air Force and served as a radio operator mechanic gunner on a B-24 bomber, later serving in the South Pacific and Japan. It was there that his hearing was permanently damaged because as a radio operator and gunner, he had to sit right next to the engines on the planes, and there were no protective headphones in those days. Ed sensed his call to ministry, and he told me that his Air Force buddies nicknamed him Holy Coley as a name, and it always made me smile when I thought of him that way, Holy Coley. After World War II, Ed took advantage of the GI Bill and went to college and graduate school, earning his Master's of Divinity from Southern Methodist University. He then returned to the Air Force as a chaplain and was sent to an Air Force base in the UP of Michigan. After a few years as full-time Air Force chaplain, Ed served several churches in the then Detroit Annual Conference and also served in the Air Force Reserve as a chaplain. In 1975, when he retired from the Air Force, he had served 24 and a half years and had earned the rank of lieutenant colonel. I served with Ed during the years that I was also working with Jim White at Newburgh. Ed was then, as I said, retired from ministry, but he was on Newburgh's staff as the pastor of congregational care. Ed defined graciousness. He had this gentle, humble spirit about him that impacted me and many others in a very profound way. Ed taught me a lot about being a pastor, and especially about the peace of Christ, which transforms our hearts despite our circumstances. Ed saw a lot in his years of service, and he shared with me that if you have Christ's peace in your heart, you can be present as Christ's vessel in any situation. As we worked together, he often shared with me about his service in the Air Force and in local church ministry. Ed was one who impacted countless lives both inside and outside of the church, and he was known and remembered for the ways in which he gave of himself in love and service. Christian freedom is about love of neighbor, selfless service across borders and boundaries. It's about welcoming others, loving others, transforming people's hearts and minds with that love. It is prophetic patriotism, which serves as a call to each of us this holiday week to practice such acts of service and sacrifice after the example of the one who calls us to his table, regardless of nationality, and simply says, "At this table, my peace is with you. At this table, all are welcomed, loved, lovable, capable. No one is rejected. Take and eat my body, given for you and for many. Amen and amen."